So my name is Roland Kulla. I'm an artist, visual artist, painter, and I've done a few other things. Well, actually, I also sang for a while. I was doing sets and costumes for operas, operettas. We did a very nice rendition of La Belle Hélène by Offenbach. I don't think I did the sets. I was singing in that one. So I've done multiple things with art, but my earliest recollections really go back to my childhood, where I just always noticed things, and I loved architecture, and I made sketches of things. So when I was, say, 7th or 8th grade, that would be maybe 9 or 10 years old. I was taking violin lessons, and I had to take the bus, which was a good distance from my house in the suburbs. And I went through very old neighborhoods, districts in St. Louis, which is where I'm from, St. Louis, Missouri. And so I was always noticing the details, the cornices, the fence, the fence posts, the designs. I'd make sketches of them. I remember, I think I was in 7th grade. I was making drawings of cathedrals, but I was also sort of making fantasy drawings of houses that I would like to design. So I still have some of those sketches. So a lot of it started off as pencil, but then I was doing some watercolor, tempera, that sort of thing, paintings of birds. My very first oil painting was, many years ago, they used to have those paint by number sets where the picture would come and there'd be all these numbers on it. That corresponded with a number on a particular color of paint, and you'd fill in the blank, and then when you were done, you had the painting. So I used the board and I used the paint, but I used my own image. So it was a street corner in St. Louis, one of the ones that I passed every week as I went to my music lesson. So I painted that, I think, when I was 13 years old. So that was my officially first oil painting. And I did a couple other after that. But when I was 13, I entered the seminary, studying to be a priest, and I switched my medium to, actually, I was still drawing things in the seminary and did different kinds of art projects for different things. But when I got to college, there was, in Louisville, Kentucky, one of the other brothers in the seminary was an artist. And so I was interested in how he did things. And so I started doing stuff in watercolors, small paintings of houses around Louisville. At that point, I was in Louisville, Kentucky. And so I still have some of those paintings. So I was pretty much doing watercolors as my primary medium until 1989. But as I said, in the meantime, I was also doing other things like singing in choruses, designing sets and costumes for different shows. Some of these sets could be quite elaborate. It would be, for a large stage, so it would be what we would call a 40-foot, I don't know what that is in meters, maybe like a 15-meter drop, 15-meter wide, maybe 10 meters high. You'd have a big backdrop of a painting, and then you'd have different set pieces that would sit in front of that. So I was designing and painting that sort of thing. And I did that maybe for about 10 years or so. But you would do these big elaborate set pieces, and they would last for like a weekend, and for as long as the show ran, and then it would all be destroyed. So after a while, I got a little tired of that. So I moved on to painting at first watercolors, and then in 1989, I got my master's degree at the University of Chicago, and and then my master's was in social work. So I left the seminary after 10 years. And then I kind of made a lateral move into social work. So I was doing that for 35 years in different forms. But in 1989, they offered 8 oil painting lessons for alumni. So I said, well, I've always been afraid of oils. I think I'm going to take that class. So they had a graduate student teaching it at the university. So I took it, and it got me to buy some oils, and he would set up like a still life, or then the first thing was a still life, and the next thing was pick a painting you really like and copy it. I still have that one. It's a painting by Hopper. But I did it, and it's like, oh gee, I can do this, and they turned out pretty good. So that got me going in oils. So I was doing oils pretty much through the 90s. And again, a lot of architectural subjects, but then I was trying some landscapes, and part of it was painted. Sometimes I would try things with knife. So kind of going through different styles and kind of expanding my technique. But basically, those 8 lessons in 1989 are the extent of my art education, and everything else I pretty much learned on my own just by doing it. So by 2000, say 1999, 2000, I was actually very fortunate in the 90s to be accepted by a professional gallery in Chicago. Actually, probably about 1994, I had just finished another, painting of a building in Chicago, and I showed it to an artist friend of mine, and he said, "Why aren't you showing these?" I don't know. So that kind of flipped a switch. And so I started looking for juried competitions to enter. And so the first competition I entered, I got accepted. And it was also a way to kind of build up a resume, because with no education, I think it was a record of being in different shows and being in juried shows, which would kind of demonstrate that somebody else has looked at your stuff and felt it was worth, entering or showing in the competition. So I really kind of started to build up my resume that way. I was kind of concerned that they would be looking for credentials, but really they were just looking for the money and good slides. So I learned early on to have my pictures professionally photographed, which always made them look good. So that's really kind of how I got started.
How did you get to paint bridges? Were they always a fascination?
Not really. I think it was more architecture generally. But it goes back to that one gallery that I got accepted by. So I had a couple of shows there, and stuff sold. So this is always encouraging. But the guys who owned the gallery were a couple of stockbrokers who decided to get into art, and so they were, they represented many young artists in Chicago. But then they decided to sort of switch their focus from just anything they could find to conceptual art. So, I'd been showing with them for probably 5 or 6 years, and then they said, well, we're really kind of move into conceptual art, so we don't really want to show your stuff anymore. And so then I started grumbling, what the hell is conceptual art? And I was going across, Chicago, I don't know if you know the city at all, but the Chicago River goes right through the middle of the center of the city, and the main streets all go across this river. The river originally was the main harbor in the city, which meant that all the bridges had to move. So we have the world's largest collection of what they call bascule bridges. They're like seesaw bridges, and they sort of open up this way. So I was going across one of these bridges one day, and I was looking at the bolt patterns on the bridge and how the sunlight struck it. And I thought, that's kind of cool. What happens if I would just take a chunk of this bridge, and instead of showing the whole bridge scene, just show one aspect of it almost really as an abstraction, but then paint it as realistically as I could. So that really is how I started. That was like 2000. And my first series I called Constructs. I didn't, and I did maybe 12 different versions of these bridges kind of in abstraction. So I guess I kind of call my style abstract realism, because once I kind of get the subject, I usually don't do the whole scene. I'll do pieces of it. Sometimes you don't know where a lot of times when people see my paintings, they don't exactly know which side is up, because I don't always show the ground. But then it becomes kind of an abstract design. But then I paint it, as realistically as possible. And I always work from photographs, so I'll go out and photograph a lot of these bridges, and then pick the images that I really like, and then kind of work it up from there. But the bridge is actually kind of a wonderful subject, because you've got, particularly in Chicago, because we've got 60 or 70 of this particular kind of bridge. And each one is designed to solve a particular problem. How do you get from here to there? You've got engineers who have, put together all the struts and the girders and all the rest of that to take the load. But I think that also becomes a very interesting subject matter. So after doing several series of Chicago bridges, then I kind of moved on to other bridge cities. So I did a series of bridges in Boston, and then I managed to, going back to that first gallery. So I got dumped by the first gallery, and then I said, well, what do I do now? So there was a cooperative gallery showing in a famous kind of old building that was dedicated to arts downtown on Michigan Avenue in the city, called the Fine Arts Building. So the cooperative meant that, we were all owners of the gallery, and so everybody got to show their stuff. And every year or so you'd have a solo show, but then you also got to do the PR and gallery set and all that sort of thing. So it really kind of showed me some of what the business side of it was. And one of the artists in the gallery was also a member of a cooperative gallery in New York. So they came up with an idea about trading shows. We sent, a van full of art to New York, and then sometime later they sent art to Chicago, and we each did shows. So their show in New York was on 25th Street in Chelsea. So they were in kind of a building with a lot of different galleries, and I had the van, so I drove all the paintings to New York, and then subsequently had to go drive to New York to pick them all up. But while the show was up, I had one of my early big bridges in the show, and about 2 weeks before the show was supposed to come down, I had an email from a gallery in New York, the George Billis Gallery, that was across the street, and said, oh, we like your painting. What can we do? So when I went to New York for the second trip, met with George, and so he started to show my work. And that's kind of how that relationship started. So that's probably that was like 13 years ago. So it took several years showing with George. He was showing my Chicago bridges, but then finally, after about 4 or 5 years and the bridges were selling, he said, okay, let's do a show of New York bridges. So then I started doing New York bridges. And I've done about 4 or 5 shows for him. In fact, he just had a show that opened last night. He just moved out of Chelsea up to Connecticut, waiting for kind of COVID to blow over. But I've got a couple of bridges in that show. So I went to New York and took lots of photos, and so I really kind of paint in series. It's like each show is usually going to be, say, 8 to 12 paintings on a particular theme. So I think my first show for George was Bridge in New York, and then there was I think there was New York City Transit, where I included a few L lines and some railroad yards, and several different. And then I think I did a whole show in the East River, which meant I did the Brooklyn Bridge and the Williamsburg Bridge and the Manhattan Bridge and the Triborough Bridge, so all the bridges on that particular river. So I'm showing with George in New York, and that's pretty much New York, New Jersey bridge material, which is very different from Chicago because the bridges there tend to be much grander because they're going across a larger space. And they don't need to move like the Chicago bridges do. And you're also dealing, I think, with some very iconic bridges, which sometimes I find almost harder to paint. Something like the Brooklyn Bridge. How are you going to do something a little different? But I've done it a number of times now, and been pleased with those results. Then, say a few years after that, a guy who kind of spotted my work was really into bridges and bridges as art, and he told me about the International Bridge Conference that was held every year in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Well, Pittsburgh is an interesting town because you have 2 rivers coming together, the Monongahela and the, I forget the other one at the moment, but they come together and they form the Ohio River. Right, and there's kind of a triangle point where they meet. So Pittsburgh is laid on top of this junction of these rivers. I don't think it's the Susquehanna. That's down around the Allegheny, the Allegheny and the Monongahela. But there's 600 bridges in Pittsburgh, and that was also the town that you had major steel production. Although most of that is gone. But the bridges were the steel was made there, and that's a historic element to the town. So I contacted the bridge conference, and I rented a booth in the convention hall, and I painted a whole series of Pittsburgh bridges. So I took some of those bridges and had them up in the booth, and then I had some that I hadn't finished yet, because sometimes people glide by my paintings and they think they're photographs, and then when people would see me painting it, they would go, "Oh, this is different." So that was one way to kind of involve the crowd. And I also talked to the the people who were running the conference, and I had some G-clay or some prints made in smaller versions of some of my bridges, and they were actually giving those away as awards and thank yous to their speakers. So that was another way to kind of get noticed. I had kind of shifted a bit into doing some printing. So I did a whole series of woodcuts and also lithograph of some of my bridges. I think I tend to paint large scale paintings. They're generally going to be, say, a meter and a half by 2 meters, because I want you to really feel like you're entering into the bridge, as opposed to it looking like a postcard. But that also gets to be an expensive proposition. So I'm thinking, how can I kind of expand my product line to have something that would be more affordable for people? So I did a series of several woodcuts and a lithograph that would sell for hundreds instead of thousands. And actually, I think the guy that was running the conference didn't buy he ultimately bought the lithograph, but he also bought the plate, the piece of wood that I had carved to make the print. So that got me going in Pittsburgh. Then this guy told me about a gallery in Pittsburgh, so I introduced myself to them, and so I've been showing with them now for probably at least 10 years, maybe longer. So I'm always doing new bridges in Pittsburgh for them. And then in the Fine Arts Building, there was a woman from Germany. She was married to an Italian, but she lived between Rome and Berlin. So she was doing, for many years, she had a small gallery there, and she was working with the students at the Art Institute to do different kinds of art installations. And she was trying to work on international, kind of international exhibits where people from Europe could then show in Chicago and kind of vice versa. So we got acquainted and became friends. And after a while, I think it would have been maybe about 8 or 9 years ago, she invited me to show in her small gallery in Berlin. So I went to Berlin, and Berlin also has 600 bridges. So I went around and got some good ones. Now, the problem with bridges in Berlin is a lot of them are small. Many of them were destroyed in the war. So I was more interested in the ones that probably pre-existed the war. They had a more interesting form. I really kind of like the bridges from, say, the 1880s to about 1930, where you've got a lot of steel and you have a more complex form. After that, things got kind of slabby and simple, and I like the complexity. So anyway, did the Berlin show, did some acrylic on paper, and then actually just this my project during COVID last year was to do a bridge in Dresden called the Blaues Wunder, and I did she showed it in October for Rome Art Week, and then it's going to go to Berlin, and I think there'll be a show there sometimes, hopefully this fall. But I did 10 different variations of acrylic on paper for Berlin Art Week, and I thought, I'm never going to get these to Rome, but I really kind of checked on if I could travel, and by the time you got through all the form on who could do what and when, it was like, well, if you wanted to come for business purposes for 120 hours, you could. So that's 5 days in Rome. So I did. So I made it to Rome, got the paintings over there, and she had her show during Rome Art Week. And then hopefully I'll go back again in the fall for something in Berlin. So that's kind of how things have developed. I think I'm going to have a show next January in an art center here in close to Chicago in Indiana. The fine arts building that I was showing at closed. And then I was showing in another gallery in the north suburbs, but they moved and didn't continue to show me. But then I did manage to get into another excellent gallery that specializes in realism. But they've sold some things, but I haven't really had a solo show there yet. And George has got a lot of inventory, so I'm kind of looking, at kind of what comes next. And I kind of like to do bridge cities. So you've had Boston, New York, New Jersey, Pittsburgh, Chicago. Another city with a lot of wonderful bridges is Portland, Oregon. So I went out there about 3 years ago and photographed those bridges. But it's tough to break into a new market, and the markets I do have, like Pittsburgh and New York, they kind of want to show local bridges because it helps, it helps sell things. So I'm kind of moving on to doing bucket list paintings where these are paintings I want to do whether I have a market for them or not. So right now I'm working on about 6 or 7 of the Portland bridges, which are really very cool. And so I'll get those done, and maybe, some of those I'll feature in the, with a mix of whatever bridges I have on hand at the Indiana show, maybe next January. And we'll see what happens. Another city I would love to do is Cleveland, because they've got a river that goes through the middle of town, very industrial, all kinds of wonderful bridges. So I got a ton of images for that. There's always there's always another bridge somewhere. There's a couple. If I wanted to get back to Europe again, there were some designed by Eiffel, because actually before Eiffel built the tower, he built bridges, and he built them all over the world. He built them in certainly France, but he built them in Portugal. He built them in Vietnam. He built them in South America. I mean, the reason he was able to build the tower on schedule was because he had very precise design and could plan it all out and have all the pieces delivered when he needed them. And so that's, the Eiffel Tower is really just a bridge up on end. But he did one in the south of France called I'm going to mispronounce this, Garabit Viaduct. I don't know.
Yes, the viaduct.
Yeah, it's a big red one, and it's just gorgeous from the photos I've seen. I would love to go do some paintings of that one. And he did one in Lisbon, but I think Garabit Viaduct is the one I would really like to do. And then there's another one on the Tay Bridge on the Firth of Forth, huge muscular red railroad bridge that goes across that one. I think there's a variation of that on the St. Lawrence in Canada. So if I don't get to Scotland, I may go up to Montreal. So we'll see what happens. And I can just take a road trip down the Ohio. There's a beautiful bridge I haven't done in Cincinnati by Roland that he designed before he designed the Brooklyn Bridge. And I went to college in Louisville. There's a bunch of good ones in Louisville. I did some of the ones in St. Louis. So, I'm always looking around for a good bridge. So I actually, at this point, since I would probably say my full-time career started, say, in 2000. So it's been 21 years. I've done over 300 bridge paintings. So I do keep kind of an index and make a sketch for each one as I finish it. So I'm somewhere around with the Dresden bridges, I'm around 310, 315. I usually end up doing about 10 to 12 paintings a year.
Do you paint covered bridges?
No, I haven't really. I think there's covered bridges. There are also stone bridges when you get out into places like Pennsylvania and some of those older areas, but also there's a lot of covered bridges, not a lot, but there's some in Indiana, there's some in Illinois, there's a bunch in Iowa. I like to kind of show some of the form, and usually the covered bridges kind of sheathe it with the siding and the roof, so it's kind of tough to see that form. So I haven't really pursued those bridges because there's so many other bridges to paint.
How did your seminary experience contribute or influence you as an artist?
The order that I was in was the Passionist order, which is sort of a brand X order and not too many people have heard of. It's not very big. But they were what they called semi-contemplative. So they would go out and do preaching, almost like Catholic revivals, also do retreats for people to come and stay in a monastery, and they would, you know, spend the weekend in silence and all that sort of thing. So you were living in a community, and but I think one of the things that it did for me is it really kind of gave me a freedom to explore stuff, you know, in conjunction with some of the other people. But you know, there was room to kind of do your thing. So that's where I really kind of started to explore the art. And there was this one brother, as I said, who was a professional artist. He was kind of inspirational for me and kind of got me trying some stuff and doing some different things. But some years ago, when I said that I was over in France looking at ruined abbeys, my ideal vacation would be to take a break. And I had gone over to a used bookstore in Chicago, near the University of Chicago, and there was a big coffee table book on Cistercian abbeys. So I got this book, and I'm looking at these abbeys, and these would be very early, most of them would be very early Gothic. So it was very simplified because it was a reform order. And so they really were focusing on kind of pure form and light. And with some of the ones that are still complete, you can see it. But I was fascinated by the ruined ones. And so I did this whole kind of tour where I went to visit these different abbeys. And as I'm reading about the Cistercians, I realized that what I had been doing in the 1960s when I was in the seminary was the same thing the Cistercians had been doing 1,000 years before. So one of the things that's happened in I'd say in the last 12 years, I was going through, well, I'll back up a bit. You know, I'm kind of painting in my apartment. So I moved out of my house and moved into an apartment, and I had a small room in the back for the maid. And I thought, that's cool. This maid's room can be my studio. Well, I started painting something, and a friend of mine looked at it and said, you know, that ought to be big. And I said, you know, I think you're right. So then I started painting big paintings, and they didn't fit in the maid's room anymore. So I went down in the basement. So I'm painting in the basement. And I got some daylight fluorescent bulbs so I could approximate daylight. So my first bridge series really were completed in that basement studio in my condo. But then around 2000, a friend told me about this place called Ragdale, which is an artist community to the north of Chicago, where they have different artists come, writers and musicians and visual artists, and you get to work on your stuff. You get a studio and work on your stuff for a couple, 3 weeks, and it gives you time and space to do your paintings or your writing or whatever. So I applied. Actually, I applied 3 times before I finally got in. But by the time I got to my 3rd application, I had begun to develop my first bridge series. So I showed a lot of pencil drawings of bridges, and then that was the place where I did my first paintings. And the thing that was particularly helpful about that experience was there were no excuses. You showed up with, 10 canvases, and you had all the time you needed to work on these. And I had never really kind of focused on it that kind of way. You were always, you've got your day jobs, you're doing that. Then maybe you take a little break and paint on the side, but that kind of uninterrupted time really helped me kind of push through where, you'd spend the morning painting and you kind of get stuck. You go have lunch and then you come back and take the next step on, where it goes. So that was really a seminal experience for me. And the other thing that was fun is that every night you'd have dinner with all the other artists. And I said, well, what have I got to talk about with, writers and whatever? But the creative process is, I think, a continuous thread. It just has different kind of form. So that actually was also inspiring. And I had a studio that had north light, and I thought, boy, this beats my basement. So after my first day at Ragdale, I came back to find a studio out of my basement, and it had good light and other artists around. So I was able to find one that worked out very well. And I had some beautiful views of the city and other artists around. So that was great. But as usual with art spaces, somebody else bought the building and that one was going condo. And so then I moved over to the Fine Arts building, which gave me the Artist Cooperative and another, good art space. But then somebody bought that building and the landlord was a jerk. And so then I'm going, the next studio I'm going to own. So I started looking around about 12 years ago and finally settled on where I live now, which was an old tavern and in the Stockyards district. So it was a good price, and the bar room is my studio. So it had high ceilings. I could tell, even though they had dropped the ceilings and bricked up all the windows and done all this stuff, that I could make something of this. So I put in skylights, I put in a nice glass block window. So it's really the best studio I've ever had, and I own it, so I know the landlord. And it was on what we call a double lot. So my house is on half the property and I had half the property for garden. And then some years later, there was vacant land to the south of me that the city owned, and there was a program where you could buy vacant city land for cheap. So I bought 2 lots next to me. So I've got three lots for garden and the house. So actually what's happened, back to the seminary question that you asked, is I really kind of built myself a very nice hermitage. And one of the things that struck me about the monasteries is that one of the dominant elements was the concept of hospitality. So they were always open for people who wanted to come and visit. So I do that. I host international visitors. I did until last year. But I think that will come again. So I paint part-time, I garden, and I'm open for people to come and experience Chicago. There's different programs that bring different people. So I've had a lot from Eastern Europe, but I've probably hosted 200-300 people. When things were really going before COVID, I'd usually get 20 to 30 guests a year, and mostly in the summertime, spring and fall, and then wintertime when there's nothing to do in the garden is a good time to paint. And I kind of take it from there. So what I've really kind of done is created almost my own little monastery. I've got some wine grapes out there, and I sort of built a small cloister. So it's my own little hermitage, and I have visions, and then I turn my visions into paintings.
I noticed that you worked with various media, watercolor, with oil, with acrylic. So you had drawings. Is there something that you would like to do in addition to these paintings?
I've actually done a couple of sculptures as well. No, I'm kind of happy with what I'm doing. I always think about maybe doing more prints, but I never quite get around to it. It's pretty much at this point acrylic painting. Sometimes I've started doing acrylic on paper, which is another way to kind of make smaller paintings, and they're a little quicker. So the show for Europe was, I did that. The first show that I did like 10 years ago, they were big paintings. They were like 1.5 meters by 2 meters. So part of the thing that had me stuck from doing anything in Europe is like, how do I get them there? So I painted them on a temporary framework. And then when they were done, I had new frames made, shipped to the gallery. I took them off the temporary frames, rolled them up, carried them on the plane in a tube, and then unstretched them and put them on the new stretchers in the gallery. But that's a pain. So I did these as acrylic on paper, and they fit into a big portfolio, which was much easier to carry than the tube and doing all the stretching and all that stuff. But it also gives me that kind of diversity in terms of product, where I'm looking at, for some people, they may love it, but they can't, my paintings now market for $10,000-$12,000, and people can't pay that. So these would be maybe $2,000 or $3,000. So it gives me kind of a diversity in the product line.
Do you have a guiding philosophy when it comes to painting?
Well, in choosing my subjects, I always start with a photograph. So I take my own most of the time, although I just found something on the web that I really liked. And so I'm painting that one. It's a bridge in Belgium, actually. I got a couple images of it, but I like something that, to me, the structure ends up being exciting. So there has to be, even though it's a stationary subject and the bridges move, a lot of the bridges move, I want to capture an image of it that is visually exciting. So it's going to would need to be balanced. I think I particularly like how different colors play. It's interesting in Chicago that they paint their bridges a deep red. In Pittsburgh, they paint the bridges a deep yellow. So it's fun, and I like usually to capture them against a blue sky, which is a very dynamic color contrast. The ones I'm working on for Portland at the moment, there's a beautiful green bridge, but instead of putting it against a blue sky, I'm putting it against like almost a black pine forest, that really makes it pop. And then I've got a red one in the hopper that'll be against a blue sky. So I think I like to do, the image has to excite me enough to put the energy in to make the damn thing. Because usually if I'm going, I frequently be working on more than one at once. Right now I'm probably working on 6, 8. And I kind of get them to a certain level, and then I see which one kind of calls to me, and I then move in to finish it. If I just was taking a painting from start to finish, I can get one done in about 30 days because I've had to do that. But I don't want to be painting a painting I'm bored with or I don't find exciting. So I guess the first person it has to please is me. And I guess one of the things that when I was first starting out, maybe for the first, when I was doing like watercolors, pen and inks, things like that, the paintings always felt very precious to me, so I never wanted to part with them. And when that light went off and it's like there was the whole thing about showing it, it became easier to part with the paintings. It's sort of like crunch all you want, I'll make more. And it was also fun to do paintings that, while they excited me, excited other people also, enough to part with money, sometimes a lot of money. So I enjoy the fact that other people enjoy the images and the visions that I've made. Well, this year I'm working on, I think it will end up being about 8 paintings. 2 will be on paper. 2 will be, well, actually, most of them are going to be pretty big. But it's this one bridge from Belgium, and all the rest of them are these bridges in Portland. I'd say the website, which is just www.rolandkulla.com, would give you probably the best selection. Unfortunately, it's out of date, and I'm not the computer whiz to keep it as updated as I wanted. So there's 3 or 4 shows that aren't on there, but you can see, probably a couple hundred bridges on the website. And some of the galleries I show with also keep a pretty good inventory. So if you went to the George Billis Gallery and looked at listing, so that's George Billis, and I think he has a lot listed. He also has a gallery in California and Los Angeles. So somebody had sent me an image of the Golden Gate Bridge, which is another one of those iconic bridges. It's hard to capture, but it was a really great view of the underside of it with all kinds of girders and stuff. So that I did that kind of as a standalone. So I think they have that one out in LA. But I think even if you just Google my name, you'd have a lot of bridges coming up.